Once again, hello everyone. Once again, it's so good to have you join us on the second edition of Gen to Gen, which is short for Generation to Generation. Together we win. And I am honored today to have as a guest in the conversation the one and only brother Kamau Ptah, a longtime friend of mine and longtime friend of the Code Spark organization. And we're going to really have a good conversation because he's been doing some great things. And so, Brother Kamau, welcome. Glad to see
Thank you. Great to see you too, Brother Ron. Great to be in
you.
your presence. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Oh, absolutely. It's always good, and particularly I can see that background scene of the island of Jamaica or Haiti. I love it. So let me open up, my good brother, by saying this question: Who is Kamau Ptah, and how different are you now from Mark Patterson?
Hmm. Right. So I'll start with just the name itself, right? Kamau Ptah, the silent warrior who divinely articulates through speech, action, written and spoken word, the architect in the mind of the creator. Right. And so that was a particular title that I gave myself as I was transitioning from Mark Patterson to Kamau Ptah. And there were elements of Mark Patterson that exist, obviously, in the essence of who it is that I am by nature, um, quiet, yet at the same time, a certain silent strength that's there. And over time, I had to translate that silence into, a more active, intentional part of my vocabulary development and confidence as a speaker. So Kamau really represents, I think, the highest vision of what Mark Patterson had for himself, that needed to be captured in a cultural stylization and with a sound and a lexicon and a frequency that really spoke to the spirit and the nature of who Kamau was and is, and who he will continue to become in my own becoming narrative, right? And Kamau is someone that I feel will always have a level of an expectation to be greater, and showing up on a day to day to be greater. And Mark Patterson, I really had a great experiences under that title as well, but I felt like I was giving more to the name than what the name was given to me.
Mm,
So,
mm, beautiful, beautiful. And, for those who know you and walk with me, you're truly a silent warrior, and you do reflect what the Most High would have us to be and become. There's no question about that. But let me let me probe a little deeper in terms of ancestral connections, because I wrote an article. You probably had a chance to read it, I hope. Reflections on a Real AI,
right,
ancestral intelligence. And I know there's a lot of folks, including your parents, but others too, who have influenced your walk,
oh,
who
absolutely,
have helped you on your call. Why don't you talk a little bit about, and think about it this way too. And part of the commentary that I wrote, I said that there are wisdom threads that we draw or have been given by the ancestors. And when woven together, those wisdom threads form our rope of hope. And sometimes when we climb into the top, we need that rope. But sometimes if we're at the bottom, maybe in the valley, we need that rope. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of those ancestral influences in your life, not only your parents, but other jugglers or elders, and what were some of the wisdom threads that they passed to you that you hold on today?
beautiful question, love it, and great to be able to honor my mother, Dawn Patterson, who's still with us, who hails from Kingston, Jamaica, and my father, who is present with us and from the ancestral plane. His name was Frank Patterson Jr. Right? And their parents, my mother's parents, my grandparents, Joyce Burroughs and Roy Bubbles Burroughs, and I lift the name of my paternal grandparents, Frank Patterson Sr. and Marie Patterson. So on my mother's side, my family hails from Kingston, Jamaica. Uh, my grandfather came to this country in the 1940s in pursuit of his desire to be a part of the jazz scene, right? And so he is a Jamaican Hall of Fame jazz trumpeter. And his narrative was that he came to this country in order to be able to, find his creative voice through jazz, landed in Harlem, New York City, then eventually moved to the South Bronx. And my grandmother on my paternal side, Joyce Burroughs, she was in the field of service and worked with mental health and mental institutions. So what I gleaned from both of them is, I play the drum, you know, um, and I'm definitely into mental health in the area. So carrying the medicine that lives in what their professions were, right? I have customized their gifts in a service that I use music as a healing modality, as a
Mhm.
way of being able to build community, as a way of being able to restore identity. And as you know, music speaks to us in ways and cracks and crevices of our consciousness that opens up portals for us. So that's what I, as a drummer, aspire to do. I'm really interested more so in drumming as a community building and healing spiritual technology. Right. And both of my grandparents were very intentional. My grandmother worked, at Bronx State Hospital in the mental health facility in the ward, and she brought her sense of humor. My grandmother was very humorous, very flamboyant. Sometimes
Mhm.
people would not put her in the realm of being tidy and proper. She was a truth teller, right? And
Uh-huh.
she did it through humor, and she did it in a very direct way, right? And my grandfather, Bubbles, he didn't have too much to say. If you really wanted to know him, you listen to his music. You really
Mm.
experience the essence of him. So there was a certain level of silence, as I recall my interaction. On my father's side, uh, my grandmother, Marie Patterson, she was what we would call a jele in the West African tradition. She was a storyteller. By both of my grandmothers, but specifically my father's mother. She read a lot. She spent a lot of time in books. Had a love for the literary word, and
Mhm.
she, was a stay-at-home mom who really provided a sacred space for her four children and really nurtured them in the way of being able to, and all of us in a way to be able to connect personally with our lineage. And she had rich stories at the family reunion. She was always one that, it was recorded and that
Mhm.
sat as the elder and told how we were all connected, in a
Mhm.
very colorful, humorous way. You know, um, I have to say, you just has to come through that both of my grandmothers were excellent cooks, right? And so my grandmother on my father's side hails from Caroline County, Virginia. So I
Mhm.
always like to say that, I had my rice and peas and macaroni and cheese.
I hear that.
When they were in the kitchen, that was always special when our families came together in that way.
Uh,
And my grandfather, Frank Patterson Sr., he was one of the first African American custom officers in
mhm.
New York City, right? And he has been recognized as with the Sentinel Society as one of the few men that started off that would help to launch the careers of other African Americans and people of color in that profession, right? And that influenced my father, he worked for HUD, Housing Urban Development, and
Mhm.
provided that level of equity. So all of these narratives, rich in the creation of Kamau Ptah, formerly Mark Patterson, really, looking through the rearview mirror, I can see everything that I do, that I have an opportunity to service community in the way, whether that's
Mhm.
career or just in my own life path, is really inspired by the gifts, the vision, the values, and the pillars that my ancestors stood on, right? And so in my own journey and so many others, as a young person, my grandfather and my father were big track enthusiasts. So I consider my first formal rites of passage after, kind of going through baptism and through Catholicism, which I
Mhm.
didn't choose. That was my family's faith
Mhm.
at that time of my journey. But the first real, well, I didn't choose this either, going to the track, right? But
Mhm.
after every year after that first experience was a choice of mine. And so my father and grandfather influenced that. Recently had a book signing, which was a reunion of my first track team, the Jaguar Track Club, right? That was based out of Harlem in 25th Precinct. And so, that was my first initial experience. And again, now looking back and reflecting, my first real rite of passage, my athletic passage, right? Where everything that was happening in that experience was really centered around allowing me to show up and confront myself,
Mhm.
as we'll, I'm sure, get into the practice a little bit more. Track had me having to compete against myself, confront my fears, endure my pains, and help me to cultivate an identity that allowed me to take on the mentality of someone who was going to try to perform at their peak level.
Mhm. Mhm.
And those are some of the things that stand as tools that I use in anything that I do today.
Mhm.
When as soon as the starter says last and final call, boys, 11 and 12, 400 meters, and you start to have to contend with your heartbeat,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And the
Uh-huh.
butterflies coming in.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes, the nerves got you feeling sleepy and yawning, and you get a headache. And how do you transcend all of that, right? How do you lock in to that
Yes.
warrior
Yeah.
mentality?
Yeah.
So those were a few just in some of my early, setting the stage early, and I
Uh-huh.
thank you for giving me an opportunity just to be able to, bring my parents and my grandparents into the space.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think it's abundantly important that, we recognize our starting point. Just like, at the starting point in that track field, right?
Yeah.
At the starting line, there was a starting point of our life that have been, impacted and influenced by those who came before them, as you well know. So to be able to lift up this ancestral wisdom and intelligence. And you even touched on the different personalities, the styles, my grandfather was this way, my grandmother was that way. But when you recall all those conversations, you can kind of, as you were talking, you probably were visualizing them too. You know what I mean? So I think that's just important for us to know that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
let me go on this on that case because I definitely want to get into the book before we close. Have you talk about that? But there were some other folks who may not have been related to you, but were influential in your lives. You know, and these are the Jegnas, these are the elders who maybe were writers, they were leaders. Name a few of them. I mean,
Yeah,
I know our
absolutely.
audience have heard some of these names, but you
Sure.
really have had some intimate experiences with some of their works. Who are a few of them?
Right. Right. So initially around this identity formation, right? I had some incredible teachers in school and as like you like to call community faculty, right? And so I'll start with, a teacher of mine in the 8th grade who taught African American studies. I was a student in Westchester County, Greenberg Central School District, and her name was Barbara Global, right? And through her, is where I read the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Hmm.
Um, you know, was exposed to people like Dr. John Henrik Clark because that was her teacher at the City College of New York. So these preeminent scholars that were leading the charge around restoring memory of our identity, I had exposure to as early as the 7th and 8th grade, through Barbara Glover, still very much a part of my journey and my life today. She was a community mother. I grew up with her son. right? So that was, you know, in the formal educational experience. Um, in my book, I share a time where I'm riding a bike through Yosemite Park, which is in Greenberg, and it's a popular park. Summertime, and I'm just riding. Everything that happens in a park in the Black community was going on. And then what pulled me was this ceremony that was taking place in the middle under a pavilion, right? And I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was drumming. It was a girls' rite of passage ceremony. So I saw women dressed and adorned in African attire, as well as girls that were present, right? And it really teleported me back and captivated me in that moment. So as I'm looking and I'm observing, you know, and questioning, well, what is this? You know, it was appeared, I didn't know the term to be sacred, but you know, that's exactly what it was. This pull and allure, this center of attraction just completely had me paused for a while. So I must have watched for about 15 minutes and I saw the energy and the sights and the sounds and the symbols that were taking place. And later on, I would meet some of these elders or jegnas that were in the community, particularly some of the drummers that were there. So there was a brother named Baba Nasi and Baba named Baba Abishai, who were community educators, community healers, community jegnas, and jegna meaning cultural custodian, right? Those who have really achieved a certain level of degree of knowledge and taken on leadership position and helping to support the health of a community. So Baba Nasi, Baba Abishai Ben Reuben, and they were all a part of the Hebrew Israelite community, which were based in Mount Vernon, New York. And they were really the cultural hub of the different festivals and educational and community-wide events that took place. So, you know, these two, that institution, which was the Bereshith Cultural Institution, was a big part of my becoming narrative because around 13 or 14, I started to go to the Shabbat services and learn around some of the spiritual traditions that were based in Hebrew, the Hebrew Israelite tradition. So that's the first time I heard the language and a prayer in a different language. And again, it was familiar and it was very captivating to be in that presence, to be in a spiritual community that was intentional about restoring identity from the core. Um, so that was there, and then influences in terms of just intellectual. I was reading a lot of Jawanza Kunjufu's work at the time, countering the conspiracy to destroy Black boys, volumes 1 through 4, and um, you know, and having gone and been able to benefit as an adolescent of the first world lecture community in Harlem, New York City, where all of these preeminent scholars, you know, so Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, you know, who wrote the book They Came Before Columbus. These were all these scholars and activists would come to the First World Alliance in a church on Convent Avenue on 145th Street. And so as a young boy, 14, 15, 16, I was being blessed by Blackness and this know thyself and this knowledge of self, right? And in the late 80s, musically speaking, as well as institutions, there was just this rich, vibrant cultural revolution that was taking place that was really being led a lot by African-centeredness, Nation of Islam, Asar Set Society, all of these institutions, and I was making my rounds, you know, and in search, right, in a quest, hungering, right, you know, because what was the other alternative? Because at the same time, this is the 80s and the crack epidemic and the lull of drug dealing as well as drug abuse is pretty prevalent around us, you know, and this sickness of being able to identify, you know, with that culture and the glitz and the glamour of that life, right? So I was really intentional about the spaces and places and fortunate to have a community that would point me in different directions based off of what they were observing inside of me.
Well, I tell you, as you were speaking about some of those influencers and men and women who impacted your life, my mind was churning too. I'm
Hmm.
thinking about a teacher I had in the third grade, Miss Goldstein, who came to my house because I had a stuttering issue, and she said to my mother, "Don't worry, we're gonna help him out. He'll be able. Just give me time." Would come out of her school to my house, and
Hmm.
help out. Then as I got older, of course, I went to Lincoln University, as you know. I was there with Gil Scott Heron, Hakeem Madabouti, formerly Donnell Lee. He used to come to the campus, James Farmer,
Hmm.
and along the way, I met Muhammad Ali. So when you think about those people that help, and there's no accident. I mean, I strongly believe that there's no accident. These people come into your lives, these men and women, for a purpose to help you develop yourself. Now, I know
Absolutely.
Brother Kamau, we could talk all day. We halfway through, but we gonna cover some other ground because there's a couple of really important questions. One more important question I want to ask you before we get into the book, because I want you to talk about the book. Let folks understand. You can see mine just I'm starting to mark it up and read it, enjoying it. But this part is important. You came into my life, 15, 16 years ago at least. That's how long we've been knowing each other. What drew you to Kozbach? And of course, those who know your work, who came to our Kozbach gatherings, will remember your signature, young man's passage and the walk of integrity, which always put me on a high. And then before that, in Philly, when we worked together, Sankofa passages. So, what drew you to Kozbach? Talk to our audience a little bit about your connections to Kozbach, and if you will, just a little bit about why thought some of these components would be important to instill in the organization.
Yes. So I attended the first Crowsbach gathering of leaders at Morehouse College, and I believe that might have been the second
Hmm.
gathering, right?
That's right.
So it was the second gathering, and the ambiance of being on Morehouse's campus with a call to action around the mission of Cosbach, right? To be able to gather all of these thinkers and activists and practitioners and policymakers and have them under one setting. So the room was full of vibrant energy and possibilities. Right. And so that was my first take on it. I was leading a school, myself and our good brother, Jonathan Foy, were the co-founders of the Urban Assembly Academy of History and Citizenship for Young Men.
Mhm.
So along with the Eagle Academy for Young Men, we were the first to start a all public boys school in New York City, since the 1960s. And so obviously based off of the work that we were doing, we saw it as an opportunity to be able to go and glean and rub elbows with all that are comrades in the work, and then bring back whatever tools and jewels that we would be able to bring back to our learning community. Right? And so it was there where the excitement began, and then just witnessing you, Brother Ron, and feeling that passionate energy of someone who embraced this particular call, as Codebach was the first national organization that was intentional about servicing this particular demographic, and thinking about it from all levels, from pre-K to post-secondary and college and beyond. So that was very exciting. And my observation there at being the first, the power of the moment, it just had me thinking about, well, what's some of the things that I might be able to contribute to this space? Because as always, every year you always put out a call for anybody who would like to be able to contribute in some way and helping to build this. And as any powerful leader, it opens the space up and puts the call out there. And so I responded to the call. I didn't have everything in my mind. I just knew I wanted to serve. And when I met you, that was the intention. I said, I'm going to be involved in some way. Right. And I
Indeed.
was looking for whatever the initiation was. I didn't know if you were going to say, all right, well, go bring me back. Go bring me back a chicken who's alive and well, right?
Mhm.
Whatever initiation trial was. So as I thought about it and I marinated it along, there were certain um, rituals and routines based off of UOC's journey, where I was bringing a lot of rites of passage practices. That's always been my path, is introducing and infusing rites of passage into conventional setting. And so when I went back and I thought about it, I drafted something that could center young people, and the strand of the young man's passages, which wasn't known initially, was birthed, because I created something every year at UOC. For about the first 3 days, we did a very intensive induction ceremony as you were entering into this new learning community. And for the first 3 days, it was all based around our mission and the rationale of why we exist. And so bringing in community and having young people reflect and engage in these exercises that allowed them to recognize that their identity determines their activity, and that we were helping them to support in their academic space to, in addition to that, cultivate a purpose in life, right? And so that was the drive behind it. And I drafted, what would be the opening ceremony and potentially
Mhm.
some experiences for the young men who were accompanying their school communities to come and participate in the gathering and have a youth strand. And so my rationale behind that was that, yeah, I saw the potential of centering young people,
Mhm.
particularly through the walk of integrity.
Mhm.
We put out a great call so that everyone could be summoned to focus on the affirmative, which what became a Coast Box ethos, the affirmative development of boys and young men, right? And having them be the start and the center, and recognize them from the optimal affirmative lens, will now have educators reflect on whether how they're seeing young boys and young men of color, right? And challenge them to address whatever the lenses that they may be viewing our young people, and invite them to begin to reflect on their own journeys as they're creating spaces for them and
Mhm.
witnessing a sacred space being created for boys and young men.
Mhm.
So that was a little bit of the impetus behind that. And then we later transitioned to Sankofa Passages program, because our good brother and elder and ancestors, and we lift his name, Ben Wright was a part of the board of Postbot and
Mhm.
was a part of the school district of Philadelphia as a superintendent.
I tell you, I reflect back on those times, and I remember being in Atlanta and you coming up and saying, "Hey, brother, I want to join the team," and you have been an essential part of the team. Anybody who knows Coach Bach, and looks at Coach Bach today remembers, the Walk of Integrity, Sankofa passages, the Young Men's Passage. Anybody who comes to any of the gatherings will remember that's your signature work. It's been a blessing from the Most High that, you came up to me that day, that I had enough common sense to say, yes, come on board. And you have the later work, of course, of Coach Bach with drum, which you have developed as well. And you've just been a real, real important blessing. I just want listeners to know that Coach Bach came out of an idea, of course, that was gifted to me from the Most High. But you have to have folks who believe that too. And so, brother, I want to say that to our national audience, local audience, just how grateful I am. So let me press on to say that something led you to put this book together. And
Mm-hmm.
for hold it up, crossing the threshold, embracing the call, conceptualizing, co-creating, and building community through rites of passage, by Kamau
Yeah.
Ptah. And it's about you. It's about the call you answered. But it's also a manual for community that is interested in saving our sons. So why don't you talk a little bit about it? And of course, there's some features in here. I always love, I found myself every time I meet a young man today, and talk to them and about who they are, what it can always end up with sharpen your eyes. So you got to say that before we close off.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That's been the call, the battle cry,
The
right?
battle cry, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So in our last 10 minutes, I want you to talk about the book, but I want you to also, to let people know even now, then we can do it at the end. How can people find out about you so they can get a hold of the
Okay,
book?
okay, definitely. All right. So the book itself, has been a part of a 20 plus year journey, right, to complete the book, right? And so this concept, again, as you learn the impetus of rites of passage, after that, I found myself infusing that and implementing programs. And then along the way, when I was called to do some graduate work, I went to Cambridge College. And my thesis paper was preparing the village to raise the child, an African-centered rites of passage process for men. So now I started to get into creating an initiation or rite of passage that would customize for communities in order for them to be able to create rites of passage in their respective communities. And what was happening, Brother Ron, is that I was being called as far as Poughkeepsie to Wyandanch, Long Island, and all in between to service young people and facilitate rites of passages for their cohort of students that they may have identified. But I didn't live in those communities. And if
Mhm.
I'm coming with maybe what might be a foreign doctrine. So I started to think about designing something that would help to customize and lead intergenerational conversations around what manhood looked like in their communities, real time, around the things that were challenges in the community, around the things that were opportunities in the community, and center young people in a way that they would be able to prepare with the notion of the core values and what manhood looked like in those respective communities. I couldn't necessarily say I can come with models of how it may exist in other areas and pull from some of the scholars and the people who had theory around them, all of the scholars I mentioned before, and then concoct them in a way that would engage how an adult may process their own identity formation and what would be significant real time for what's in front of them. What is the crying call that young people, based off of trauma, as well as can we even think aspirationally beyond this of what our community leads? And so as a facilitator, what I began to do, and that's what started it. So 20 years down the line, so right after Cambridge, shortly after, UOC began. And
Mhm.
uh, that call I responded to a little bit reluctantly, but it was a blessing that came through because I started to think about real time how this rites of passage philosophy and concept and practices can live in a conventional space, right? And so then documenting all of the different um, systems that were created as a school-wide, as well as classroom pedagogy, and thinking about how those things live in teachers' facilitation of their classes, at their actual subject area classes. So those things were starting to compile. And then during COVID, it presented an opportunity. I was terminated from a position at Nassau Community College,
Mhm.
and in the height of the COVID. And all of us, I see that as a rite of passage. That whole experience of COVID was a global initiation, right?
Mhm.
Where people had to really confront themselves on the level of their beingness when they're not doing the things in their norms and routines. And so I experienced that same thing. And as I was looking at the practice, it was always initially designed just to be a manual and a guide for the technical side of rites of passage. Then I started to really reflect on my experience during this traumatic time in our lives. And I started to think about all of the things that I never formally went through an initiation or rites of passage until adulthood. So I had to think from the lens of the phases and the root meaning of rites of passage. And I started to reflect on my own journey from that lens and those things that aligned with the rites of passage meaning and the phases of them. And then I started to tell my story around that. And in addition to telling my story, I also wanted to help people reflect on their story from that mirror and lens perspective of the phases of a rites of passage. So that's a part of that experience when I'm facilitating for adults, is for them to contextualize their lives from a rites of passage
Mm-hmm.
lens. And
Mm-hmm.
then from there, if anybody is called to facilitate that and for family, community, educational settings, coaches, then there are tools that I provide within the book that help to support that. So I try to do my best to provide a holistic piece so that people can internalize and really find themselves on the rites of passage compass, because this is a omnipresent reality. Right now,
Mm-hmm.
as we speak, we can choose to address and confront what potentially would be something that will put us in an uncomfortable situation, because it's either confronting something we haven't addressed before, confronting some type of a trauma. And as soon as you enter into it, the rites of passage process unravels itself.
Mm-hmm.
The formal process of going through it is to prepare you for the life initiations that are going to happen. So there's a being able to look at it from the context of helping people see their lives from that context. It's almost like a reverse engineering, because you didn't have the formal experience per se
Mm-hmm.
under the brand or the packaging of an initiation. Now that you have the understanding how your life looks like that, now we can formalize that and glean from the lessons so that it prevents a preventative and some social boundaries and protects you. Now, especially from a community standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Like, there's, and in this life of our young men particularly, there's been a negative rite of passage that too many of them that we've lost have undertaken.
Right.
You know, and some of that rite of passage that led them to the penitentiary or worse. So this intervention, as Susan Taylor said, our village being on fire, by embracing this as a community or individuals, this has us a chance to hope of putting out the fire. Now, I see we have 5 minutes left to go, but let me ask you this question. Maybe you could kind of sum up, and then I want you to also give again how people can find you. What was the best part of writing this book for you?
Mhm. Yeah, the best part was to revisit the people and the spaces and the places that helped to influence my journey and my narrative. That was clearly the part. And then also really seeing and gleaning from the lessons. Because if you go through in a blur and you haven't been reflective, then you can't pull the jewels that have created a demarcation of who it is that you are,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so writing from the frame of reference of the enlightenment, just being able to look at my own narrative and then customizing an experience that I know that when other people intentionally respond to the prompts and to the questions and to some of the exercises, will be able to see themselves from an empowering, affirmative standpoint and begin to think about even some of the most challenging areas in their lives as great, the tools and the bridges to great achievement. None of us would choose trauma as a way of learning.
Mm-hmm.
No one would consciously wake up and say, I'm going to go through this particular experience of life that is going to create this level of pain and trauma and have to confront the fear of the circumstances that I'm presented with. We wouldn't necessarily say that that's the direction I'm going to go unless you start to have those experiences where you see the value of that. So that's also a big part of it, is knowing that there's a potential for someone to be able to find purpose and life purpose. And there's a saying, the purpose of life is a life with a purpose. So,
Amen.
one of the reasons why we exist is to be able to um, align ourselves and discover the meaning of why we exist and why we're here, and to be able to
Amen.
make our contribution to the expansion and evolution and the ascension of, who we are and who our community is, to leave it, as they say, more beautiful and beneficial than we inherited.
Amen. Well, I'm going to encourage everyone to get this book because, as Kamau said, it's practical, it's doable, but it's necessary for rebuilding our community and revisiting our past and saving our sons and our daughters and our families and our communities. So, Brother Kamau, I want you to do two things. And because we're into 1 minute left, 2 minutes left. You got to give me a sharpen your eyes. We got to close off with that.
Right.
But
Okay.
before we do that, how can people get in contact with you? What's your email address or the best way to do that?
Right. So my email is Akoben, AKOBEN, the number 41 at gmail.com. Right. You can also find me on Facebook under Kamau Ptah. I'm on Instagram, kptah69, and embracing crossing the threshold. Crossing the threshold. You can find me on Instagram with that. Then also, if you want to visit me on my website, go www.aquabenenterprise.com. And I'm also, the latest venture is what we're doing with healing initiations, inspired by Maladoma Some, shaman from the Burkina Faso. We're doing some work that is consistent with his village's approach to indigenous spiritual technology, right, that we use in a way that is initiatory. So if you go to www.mahabahouse.com, Mahaba is spelled Mahaba. So that is all of my different contact
All
information.
right, so folks, you can find Kamau. He's giving you all these different ways to find him and find him. I want you to locate it and get that book. So let's close with sharpen your eyes.
All right, so in the words of Listervelt Middleton, and this comes from his poem On the Origin of Things, On the Origin of Things was one of the rituals that existed at the First World Alliance. They would invite someone every week to read two of his poems, and On the Origin of Things was one of his poems. So Listervelt Middleton, real quick, journalist, scholar, right? And he had a show in South Carolina entitled For the People. So I took this quote from his poem and made it more affirmative and aligned it to the ritual practices that I've orientated thousands of men and young men in our community. And it goes like this: sharpen your eyes, tune your ears, so you know what you see, understand what you hear. Minute by minute, hour by hour. As we know our story, we know our power. So salute to Listervelt Middleton.
A salute to you, Brother Kamau, and thank you so very much. And we want to get this out to the world, and we want this book to be a bestseller. Love you, brother.
Love you too, and I have to just thank you, Brother Ron, for seeing me and creating the venue and the space to be able to provide this offering on a grander stage. And my life took on a different meaning when I came a part of the Cosbach family, and of course when we did the work with Sankofa. Thank you for your visionary servant leadership and your transformational approaches, and beyond being someone who led that cause, someone who's served as a Jegna in my life. Thank you, brother. I had to say that as
well. Thank you, brother.
All
Have a
right.
good day.
All right. You too, brother. Take care.